today, commercial life and markets through the history of political thought, and why some of the greatest capitalist and free market thinkers of the tradition think we should have more taxation and more redistribution. I'm Cliff Mark, and this is Good in Theory. Today, I have with me my friend Jeffrey Bercuson, who has just written a book called A History of Political Thought, Property, Labor, and Commerce, From Plato to Piketty. The book is brand new, and it's kind of a run through the history of political thought. There's 13 chapters, each devoted to a different author. You've written a book called A History of Political Thought, and that is a very tall order, right? That's there's a lot of material there. So how have you narrowed it down? What is the focus of this particular history of political thought?
Sure. Yeah. It is an ambitious endeavor, to be sure, to try and tell my own version of the sort of canon of the history of political thought. But the way that I decided to make this task more manageable was by focusing in on a central thematic concern, and that concern was market society. Right? The role that markets and commerce play in the lives of individuals and in the lives of communities. So I decided that would sort of be the theme running through the whole book, right? What do all of these canonical thinkers, some more canonical than others, but what do they all have to say about the effect that commerce has on our lives? So again, I cash that out in a lot of different ways. One of the big themes through the book is human nature, right? So what do these philosophers have to say about human nature, about what a well-lived human life looks like? And in some cases, what we find is that engaging in commerce pulls us away from that good life.
Right.
And in other cases, it's an essential part of it. I spend a lot of time thinking about community. Right? How does the existence of a market and of commercial activity affect the well-being of communities, right? Does it undermine the possibility of a deeper and more meaningful solidarity? And of course, I also want to think about the state, right?
Right.
What is the appropriate relationship between the state and the market? So different thinkers have much different ideas about what the state ought to do, for example, when it comes to the regulation of markets, the redistribution of income, things like that.
Okay, so maybe if I can summarize, like, 'cause, I've read this book, I really enjoyed it. What you've got is 13 chapters, a lot of really big names like Plato, Nietzsche, Machiavelli, Locke, so on and so forth. And what you're doing is you're taking each of them, and instead of like going really in depth into their political philosophy, you look at their philosophy through the lens of this, like, I don't know if I want to say capitalism or market side, but this specific aspect of human life, which is commercial activity, productive activity, earning a living, getting money, getting rich, contracts and stuff like that. And it's like conceived of, I'm just throwing out a bunch of words because it's conceived in different ways, but there is this kind of aspect of human life, and there's a lot of different approaches to it, and different relations to, like, as you said, your three big themes were, I think, how it's related to human nature, how it relates to community, and what is the state's role in dealing with that. Is that more or less...
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. I guess I just sort of had this lingering sense that this was sort of like a very useful sort of answer key that we can use to sort of map onto each and every thinker. And it provided, I hope, a valuable way to compare them, right? To see the differences, to see where there are certain alliances, some more surprising than others, and where there are deep disagreements. I think that when you sort of often learn this canon, I kind of found that this question of markets and commerce and work and money was often sort of treated as a kind of side issue, right?
Right.
Something peripheral, right, to the center of things. And really, actually, what I found is that when we plugged this idea of the market right into the center of things, we were still able to get to the core of every thinker, but we also sort of began to see them in a new light, and I think a much more practical light. Like, so for example, someone like Hegel, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine a more obscure and difficult thinker. But I think that when you center what he has to say about the ownership of property, about getting a job and learning the skills necessary to do that job, these are like surprisingly practical and intuitive and compelling claims, right? He's sort of like, it's a way to bring a lot of these thinkers down to earth in a way that is tangible.
I think,
right?
I mean,
We're
like
all
with
still
Hegel, you're more right about this with Hegel than I think any of the thinkers of your book, because if you want to learn what Hegel has to say about politics, and you start logically with the logic, you're never going to get anywhere, right? But if you want to learn about Hegel and you start with the philosophy of right, and particularly the stuff on civil society, then that's where I, at least when I was learning this as an undergraduate, started to like find my way in to what's going on. But like before we jump into Hegel, which is like, in a way it's old timey, but in a way it's very modern. I just want to give a little bit of an overview of like the plot of the book, okay?
Sure,
of like
sure.
the ups and downs of of the reputation of commercial life within political philosophy.
Sure.
So the first chapter you have is like Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, I believe, and it's, if I can, be just slam it into a nutshell, it's like why old timey guys hate commercial life, right?
Yeah.
So these older thinkers are really critical of this aspect of life. Can you tell us why, and why for so long?
Sure. So the very first chapter of the book is the sort of ancient and medieval background, and the overarching theme of that chapter is the deep-seated suspicion about commerce that runs through the sort of key thinkers, right? In these eras, right? So that's certainly true of Plato. It's true of Aristotle, though I think that there's a little bit more nuance there, and it's certainly true of Aquinas as well, right? Again, the idea of the chapter is that money making pulls us away from the things that really
Right.
matter in life.
Like
so
what?
So Plato, in the Republic, listeners of your podcast will know that there's a particular image of human flourishing, right, that informs the Republic, and that the money-making motive, right, is something that pulls us away, right, from that good life.
Yeah, we should be
right?
doing philosophy and studying triangles, not trying to stack up
that's
our
right.
drachmas.
Yeah. More triangles, less debits and credits, right? And in fact, a big part of chapter 1 of the book is discussing books 8 and 9 of the Republic, where sort of the unleashing of the market and the unleashing of the commercial impulses that animate it puts us on the path to tyranny, right? It's an unimaginable tragedy. With Aristotle, again, as I said, it's a little more complicated. I think he's a little bit friendlier to commerce, but at the end of the day, I think he shares Plato's suspicion, right, that unleashing this desire to make money pulls us away from the things in life that really matter.
Okay.
Right?
So obviously, as a guy who's making a podcast that so far has just been about Plato, I'm interested in what ancient thinkers and medieval thinkers have to say on their own terms. But that is not, I don't think, the only interest of your book. It seems to me that you make these historical thinkers speak to today's debates, contemporary debates. And so I'll just outline kind of the ideological landscape as I see it, and maybe we can talk about how your book applies to it. Now, the way I see it, at least, as I was growing up and over the past 30, 40 years, the debate to me about commerce and labor has been primarily between one side, which is a kind of laissez-faire capitalism, very free market. Some people call it neoliberalism, but this idea that markets should be completely free. They do a lot for us, and states should be minimal. They shouldn't be interfering. And on the other side, you have a reaction, or you have the other side, which is more interventionist. Sees a greater role for the state, and at the extreme, you might have some kind of totalitarian communism that people, would try to scare us with in the Cold War. But I mean, the essential debate seems to be between a kind of neoliberal, laissez-faire ideology and a more interventionist one on the other side. And you're bringing us a book that is full of historical characters like Plato, Machiavelli, Hobbes. How does your book speak to some of today's issues before we go on to the...
Sure, absolutely. I think you're right that we can describe our era as the kind of triumph of a kind of, in my mind, objectionable laissez-faire ideology, right? The last thinker that I cover in the book is Piketty, and he uses the language of neoliberalism, but fundamentally what he's talking about is that sort of laissez-faire attitude that you're describing, right? Which is boils down to the state ought to do as little as possible when it comes to the regulation of markets, redistribution of income, monitoring of wealth and income passed down between the generations, et cetera.
So like
cetera,
minimalist state, night watchman, you might.
That's right.
Say.
That's right. And I guess if you read the book, you'll see that is kind of simplistic and borderline deranged view of some of the things that very smart people have said about how the state ought to govern the market.
That's great. I think that's a really interesting part of your book is how it shows that a lot of the big pro-market philosophers of the past might not look upon today's free market ideology and be happy about it. And we shouldn't be surprised because obviously they were operating in a completely different context, which you do a lot to restore them to. But let's get back to that idea of looking at what very smart people in the tradition have said about the relation between the state and the market. We talked a little about chapter 1, and you got Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas, and they're all very, very suspicious of all commercial life. Money making is going to distract you from what's important. But then there is a shift. In the early modern period, you start to canvass some thinkers who have more positive things to say about that market. Or to say about the market. And can you tell us a little bit about that historical moment, even if that moment lasted a couple of 100 years?
Yeah, sure. Well, my entry point here is with Machiavelli, right?
Okay.
And I interpret Machiavelli and Hobbes. I sort of lump them together despite their differences. And the reason I think that they belong together is because I think they're the first important thinkers to start to question whether or not the Platonic, Aristotelian, and Christian attitude towards commerce is actually good for us. Right, so we have all of these centuries of hostility to money making, and this emphasis on the need for piety. And Machiavelli and Hobbes are important and worthwhile because it's possible for them to imagine a new way of doing things, right? A new foundation for social life, right? Not virtue, not piety, but commerce.
Right? Oh, I get, okay. Commerce. Well, look, I might have my reservations about how specifically commercial Machiavelli and Hobbes are, but there's certainly, I think, this turn from, Plato saying focus on the forms, and Aquinas saying focus on God, and then Machiavelli and Hobbes saying, you know what, actually, maybe life on Earth, this life is worth a damn, and commerce might play like a big role in our worldly happiness. So that, I mean, that, as I take it from your book, is like the beginning of the shift where people start more and more to develop the positive side.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what we could say is we get a kind of instrumental or practical or very pragmatic attitude towards commerce, right? In Machiavelli and Hobbes, right? In the Christian tradition, it's right something to be feared and to eradicate, right? Whereas Machiavelli and Hobbes treat the impulse to accumulate as a fact about our nature, right? And a potentially useful pillar for building a new kind of life together. Like maybe we can live more safely together, more peacefully, right? If we recognize that we possess these interests and give them a meaningful standing.
Okay, great. So we go from ancient medieval thinkers thinking, market bad, but then with Hobbes and Machiavelli, there begins to be this recognition that there might be some practical, instrumental benefits to commerce, to market society. But there's also a lot more to the pro-market argument. So where do we go from there?
Sure. Yeah. So a big... So I guess what we could say is that the really sort of meaty part of the book is when we shift from this sort of practical or pragmatic, right, attitude towards the market towards a much more robust defense of it, right? So in Machiavelli and Hobbes, right, there's sort of like this sense that if we just let people accumulate their property and live a quiet life and get rich, and if as long as the state doesn't take their stuff, we can be quiet and happy, and we're not going to be killing each other over obscure conceptions of what God wants from us. So that's again a practical or utilitarian defense, but the story then changes, right? We start to get a kind of ethical defense of the market, and this starts with Locke, right, who says that a market society is more likely to be a society with secure rights, something like democracy, though not, of course, our idea of democracy. But I guess this story really takes off with Adam Smith and with the Germans like Kant and Hegel.
Okay. So, I mean, you mentioned something there, a distinction between instrumental defenses of the market and like what you called more robust ones. And I want to sharpen that a little bit. Okay,
sure.
So I agree. I guess I see how Machiavelli and Hobbes are giving instrumental defenses of the market, but I also think that other thinkers do too. So Smith, as he's commonly understood, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of the point of markets is that we can produce more and we can all like get rich together. The rising tide raises all boats, division of labor, et cetera, et cetera. We are going to be more wealthy. And I think I see something like that in Hayek too, that the attempt to plan economies is bound to be a disaster. It's going to destroy wealth and result in tyranny. So that is kind of the instrumental side of it. I think it goes like a bit beyond Machiavelli and Hobbes. So just first I want to ask, is that more or less right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that there I think both sides can be present in Smith and in Hayek and in anyone else, which is to say there are both instrumental, right, aspects to their defense, which is that, so for example, a market society is simply more likely to be more efficient, or a market society will be less corrupt because lawmakers have less power, or a market society is simply the only option we have given the diffuseness of economic information. So that's sort of on the more instrumental side of the spectrum. And all those ideas are present in Smith and in Hayek too. But what I mean by the ethical side, right, is that a market society is good for us as human beings, which is to say it's the sort of society in which we can more fully harness our nature.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Fully harness and then realize our nature.
So I'm gonna push you a little more on that. I'm really interested in here's the reason why, is because the Hayek Smith efficiency pro-market arguments, look, capitalism, free enterprise, it just makes us richer, and that's why we should have it. Leaving aside how empirically based that is, this is an argument I think we're all familiar with, and people always make to defend markets, the efficiency argument. But I also think that these other arguments that you're talking about are there all the time. I think that people really care about the moral aspect of commercial life. So can you tell me a little more about that? About like what is the moral defense beyond just efficiency of a big role for free markets?
Sure. I mean, ultimately, and this goes back to our earlier discussion about laissez-faire. I mean, I guess there's a thread running through all these pro-commerce thinkers, which says that a market society is likely to be the freest sort of society, and that freedom is the space in which human beings, right, fully realize, right, the abilities and talents at their disposal.
Okay. Tell me a little. So we have markets are important because we're free, but what freedom means is a kind of self-realization. It's like I have these capacities and I go to work and it's an important part of human life that I can exercise these capacities. Is that who are we talking about here?
I think that there's an inkling of this in Smith that really gets picked up, right, by Kant and Hegel, and who take it much further than I assume Smith would probably be comfortable with. I think the ethical dimensions of the argument are a bit off to the side in Smith. I think that he has a much more practical, political, programmatic concern.
Right. Well, you count on the Brits for like pragmatics, and you count on the Germans for the like spiritual dimension of money making.
That's right. That's exactly right. I think that the German interpreters to Smith really focus in on this idea of freedom, and for them it's it cannot be detached from this idea of realizing oneself in the world.
Okay, so let's separate the two, Kant and Hegel. Kant, give me the like quick summary of Kant's view of the role of markets and like why they're important and good for human freedom.
The key idea, I think, is that competition, right, is what draws out our talents. What makes us refine and develop our rational capacities, right? This isn't done when things are easy and peaceful. It requires competition, and market society is sort of the essential site of that competition.
So, okay, in Kant's view, is it that the competition, the struggle, is it a struggle to survive or is it a struggle to win?
I think I think that it starts out as the former, but then becomes the latter.
So we are like these competitive beings who just want to beat each other, and that's maybe bad morally, but the upside of it, the like cunning of reason or whatever, is that
sure,
it helps us develop our capacities and our reason, at least our instrumental reason, in some way.
like Kant's phrases are asocial sociability, right? We want to best other people. We're fundamentally competitive by nature, and that means we can't live without other people either. And so markets are one way to channel, right, this competitive
Uh-huh.
energy, right? We're not talking about war waging anymore, right? It's a kind of Hobbesian impulse in a way, right? It's like we all are self-interested, and we're manic and vital, and we're always acting, and we need to find new and better and more constructive ways, right, to channel all of these competitive energies. And then the story, I guess, of when as we move into the Germans, right, is how this becomes an account of what freedom looks like in daily practice. Suddenly, freedom becomes indistinguishable from our status as participants in market
All
life.
right. So the market is like a safer way for us to compete than war, and
Hmm.
it helps us develop our capacities. And so, in a way, there's an economic benefit, but there's also this benefit that we're not killing each other. Um,
Yeah.
and so, how does that change when we move from Kant to Hegel?
Sure. Well, I mean, we have a lot of metaphysical baggage operating in the background, right? For the Germans, right, nothing is haphazard, nothing happens willy nilly, right? If we've managed to detach ourselves from feudal life, if we suddenly have this open, dynamic economy with a new degree of class mobility, right? If these things exist, right, then there must be some reason for their existence. And the reason,
Uh huh.
right, is that the existence of these new modern institutions and these new modern practices is that it makes our freedom possible,
Okay, so it's
right?
like
By
a
giving us,
teleological view. You're saying so these are like people who believe that everything happens for a reason.
yes, I don't think that you can get around that, right,
Uh
in
huh.
either Kant or Hegel. Certainly not. And I mean, later there's going to be a big back. I mean, there's going to be a big backlash against this idea, of course. But yeah, I think that, I mean, this is the aim of the philosophy of right, to sort of reconcile us to our social world, right? I mean, again, nothing happens haphazardly. Like,
Hmm.
human life can't just be the realm of chance, right? Where there's no rhyme or reason to the things that happen, right? If we used to be serfs and now we're
Uh
free,
huh.
right? Well, then we need to understand, right, what that freedom means and what it actually looks
Right.
like.
So like Hegel looks at the shift, and this is a lot of the all the thinkers we've been talking about so far, from Machiavelli to Hegel, they're still all in this like long shift from a more feudal hierarchical society to
Yeah.
a modern egalitarian one. And Hegel's
Hmm.
more towards the end of like, he's the most recent thinker we've talked about so far. And so
Hmm.
he cares about modernization in this sense, right? The move from
Hmm.
like
Hmm. Hmm.
feudalism to modernity, and he sees there's an internal truth to it and something good to it. Um,
Hmm.
and so, great, it's happened for a reason.
Hmm.
What, on Hegel's view, is that reason?
Uh, uh, why has this
Yeah,
happened?
what is the expanding role of commercial life in modernity?
Hmm.
What does it give to us?
Yeah, it gives us a space to figure out who we are.
So it's like a
Right?
self-realization, like, oh,
Yeah.
I always wanted to be a telemarketer, and now I can go out in the in the economy and become a telemarketer and realize that aspect of myself and develop those important capacities.
I mean, I think that I mean I that is the view is, right, that work, right,
Uh-huh.
is not the highest, but a very meaningful instantiation of our freedom, right? So we figure out who we are and what we can be, right, through work, right? I mean, Hegel says the same thing about the family, right? The family is another important instantiation of our freedom because we take on different roles, different responsibilities, and it's in the willing fulfillment, right, of those roles and responsibilities that we become ourselves, right? There is no us apart from our status as, son, husband, father. And he applies the same intuition to our work, right? There is no us apart from our working as teacher, right? Podcaster, right? We figure out who we are, exercise our talents, and then become members of a community too.
Right. Okay. So it's like this important part of a social integration and identity through your job, through your work. You become who you are, you find out who you are, and you're like linked to others. And this happens through the market, which he calls civil society, and through the family and through the state. Is that right?
Well, yes, that is certainly I think the highest form of freedom for Hegel, right? That's the third side of ethical life is the state, and for him, patriotism is also a constitutive part of the well-lived life.
So, like, I mean, this is,
but that's where things get kind of frightening.
Well, I mean, you were talking about like there is no I apart from we kind of language, and at least in Hegel, like that is true. He is on the communitarian side of the liberal communitarian split. But if we look at specifically Hegel and his philosophy of right, we talked about the state, the family, and civil society, or the market. And isn't it right that in the market, that's when I is mostly me? Like, we get to know ourselves as isolated, atomized individuals precisely within the market as a part of our life.
Yes, and that's a valuable and essential moment in the history of freedom that Hegel wants to tell, right? How we assert ourselves, right? The I, and we work on the world, and our ideas are instantiated in the world, and we see ourselves and our ability to do things and to make things. But that's also not the end of the argument, or not the end of the story that he tells, right? In asserting ourselves, we also come to recognize our fundamental interdependence, right? And this interdependence manifests itself in different ways, right? We depend on other people as customers, for example, right? We depend on other people as fellow producers, right? I mean, when we make things, we're accessing a whole history of productive activity, right? That makes us both individual producers, but also members of potentially very long-lasting communities.
Right. Okay. So this is one of my favorite chapters of the book, and it's one of my favorite arguments because I'm a big Hegel fan. So the idea is that the market isn't just important because it creates prosperity, but it is a social institution. And when individuals take part in it, we are trading with each other, we are integrating socially, we're making connections with others. It kind of has a social integration aspect. But there's also a self-realization aspect. We get to know ourselves. We get to know our capabilities. And so it's kind of like self-realization, recognition, and this is a large part of what we're doing in commercial activity. And it's not only in the market, but that's one important aspect of our lives and our identity. And the reason I find this so interesting is because this is kind of always implicit and often explicit still in today's debates over economic matters. So the reason jobs are often so important politically is not just because people need some kind of basic income to survive, although they also need that. It's that work provides a kind of social identity and standing, and you get all sorts of depression and mental health issues from long-term unemployment. And so the question of our participation in market life is much more than a question about resources. It's a question about identity, self-realization, and I guess you would say freedom, right? So could you speak a little to that? Do you see this Hegelian argument still in today's debates?
Yeah, no, I think that's I think an important part of the book. I mean, I think it runs through so many different thinkers in the book. I mean, if we celebrate the market, right? The reason we celebrate that market society, is because of the contribution to human freedom that it makes. And again, I think the contrast to the feudal world is a pretty powerful one, right? In the early modern period, when all these thinkers are grappling with this new set of institutions, right, it seems to them to be a very good thing, right? Before we were enslaved, and our prospects for living a happy and prosperous life were nil, right? And now the world is much more open, right? There's a higher degree of mobility, and suddenly more people are more free than they ever have been before, right? Now, of course, when we map society today, right, onto that sort of defense, I guess modern society doesn't compare very favorably, right, with this idea of freedom that I'm describing.
I would still take. I think I would still barely take driving for Uber over being an actual medieval serf.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I, you know, this is at the heart of why people defend, right, our sort of society, right? And so, the obvious question that our conversation has raised, right, is if that society no longer embodies the central value that made it desirable in the first place.
Great. I want to dig into that a little bit, because if the market's supposed to create this human freedom and self-realization and these values that all these thinkers in the past have celebrated about it, but you're saying what we wound up with doesn't necessarily create those values. Why not? Because in some ways, people might say that commerce and the markets play a greater role in our lives than ever. They're in better reputation. They might even be more free than ever. So why isn't the state retreating from the market and letting, capitalists do what they will? How come that isn't creating all the freedom that we might hope it would, based on these arguments that we've heard from Hegel and other thinkers in your book?
Yeah, this is a theme in the book, right? Namely, what is the appropriate balance, right, to strike between market and state? Obviously, this is an ongoing debate, but one of the things that I think was striking in all the thinkers that I covered is that neither, right, tended to one, or at least of the more contemporary thinkers, right? None of them lean wholly in one direction, right? It's sort of, once we get into the 20th century, right, it seems like the main endeavor, right, the main intellectual task is to articulate where the balance between state and market ought to be struck, right? Total state control, right, is now off the table, right? And so too is total laissez-faire, right? So and that's true of Keynes, for example. So there's a chapter on Keynes, and the misconception is that he believes in complete and total state control, but in fact, right, he's a proponent of markets and merely thinks they need proper shepherding, right? And in fact, one of the surprising findings is that Hayek fundamentally says the same thing. He ends up on the other side of of this argument, but it's not a complete and total laissez-faire sort of argument that we get even in Hayek,
Right. So
right? I
okay.
say
Um.
that's an argument that comes from his deranged disciples.
Okay. Yeah. So I just want to go back to that point because I think this is really important and like an important insight that comes out of your book, which is that today, as I've been framing it, the sort of quick and dirty formulation of the ideological cleavage or the debate is that it's either absolutely free markets, laissez-faire, government stay out,
Sure.
government bad, markets good, or government's good, markets bad. And within this, we all know Keynes advocates governments affecting markets. He doesn't want to eliminate them, right? He's not a complete state planner, but he got put on the kind of left side, the interventionist side. And so he kind of stands in for a little too much government interference, this leftist interventionist view. And Hayek, he has become like this intellectual hero to the laissez-faire people, the libertarians. And what you're saying is actually, look, Keynes was not didn't want the government to completely control the economy. And Hayek, this purported hero of libertarianism, actually did advocate a certain level of government intervention. So could you tell us a little about that?
Sure, about Hayek,
Yeah.
or sure. Well, I mean, I'm no expert on Hayek, but I was as generous to him as I mean, I was as generous to him as I was to everyone else, even though I had my own preconceptions coming to it. But what I ultimately found is that I didn't have to be quite so generous, and that there were many reasonable statements about the need for careful state regulation of markets, the need for the fact that any great society has a meaningful modicum of care for its least advantaged citizens, right? There's certainly no anarchist impulse there, right, to annihilate the state.
Yeah, there's like a lot of welfare state stuff, right? Like infrastructure, public education, like you said,
Sure,
some like
yes,
provision for the needy.
sure, you know, again, this goes back to this idea of balance, right? He'll even say that it may be reasonable for the state to engage, say, in the provision of healthcare, so something like socialized medicine, but not but we need not go so far as to eliminate private innovation either. Right. I think Hayek's point is that states have a tendency to ossify, and the market is the site of dynamism, right? So that there might be certain areas where state activity and assistance is necessary, right? But it should never be so robust or so generous as to negate the possibility of innovations, right, in the private sphere.
Okay.
Right, because again, that's where the interesting stuff happens, right? And I mean, for Hayek, that's just the nature of economic information.
Right. So okay, so
Right.
okay, so when you say that it's the nature of economic information, do you want to just explain that and cash that out?
Sure, I just that there's a kind of epistemological argument in Hayek, right, about the knowledge that is available, right, to people engaged in economic activity, right, and his point is that those who aspire to a higher total degree of state planning, right, this implies the presence or the possession. The existence and possession, right, of more information than any institution could possibly have.
Right.
Right. Economies and markets are two complex, too dynamic, right? Information is too diffuse and dynamic to ever be to ever for state planning, right? To ever be
Sure. But
possible.
that's one thing I think is important to note about Hayek is that he's most worried about a Soviet 5-year plan, right? He's not worried
Yes,
about
absolutely.
Medicare for all in the States.
Yes, if we understand him in context, yes, as I tried to do. I mean, that's just it. He's got the Soviets in mind, and he's got Hitler in mind.
Right. So I guess, I mean,
And that is why.
Yeah, go on.
And that's why, as we move into the 70s, I think that he becomes more comfortable with a kind of uncharacteristic vernacular about how a great society treats its least advantaged members. This is not the sort of talk that is present in the early work. And I mean, I'm not going to say that it's his central concern, right? But it's present.
You mentioned his deranged disciples. Who are you talking about? What do they say?
Well, in the book, I talk about Buchanan, James Buchanan, and Milton Friedman, and these are the kind of laissez-faire zealots who I think there's a compelling case to be made are responsible for the catastrophe that we currently find ourselves in, not just in the rich part of the world, but in the poor parts of the world as well.
Okay.
Right? And these are the people who have fundamentally edited out, right, any of these concerns, right, for the poorest members of our society, because for them, any form of taxation or any form of redistribution is an encroachment, right, on the freedom of the successful.
Okay, so here, let me try this out. In your book, Hayek is kind of the furthest right, laissez-faire type guy that you have a chapter on, and then you talk about he has the argument that you just gave, but he still has some kind of like he's okay with some state intervention. Then he has these deranged disciples like Friedman and Buchanan, and they are the real laissez-faire guys. And they say any interference by the government, any government action at all, except for like police to guard property, distorts the market and will make us less prosperous because what I think is on the face of it, both Hayek and the deranged disciples, Friedman, Buchanan, on the face of it, they're trying to make an efficiency argument. They're saying we'll be poor. At least Friedman is. But the thrust of it seems to also be this moral argument, because they're saying their whole rhetoric is that like any government interference, it's not just going to make you poor. It's like this violation. It's this violation of your freedom where you're supposed to be, realizing yourself and working for money and getting rich.
Oh, yes. Buchanan pulls no punches here. And in fact, he sort of lumps all forms of state intervention into what he calls a Platonic worldview of masters and slaves.
Give me a little biographical background of James Buchanan. Not the president.
University of Chicago in the aftermath of Hayek.
Okay.
Right, economist. I'm pretty sure he won the Nobel Prize, if I'm not mistaken. I have to look that up, but he I mean, of course, he has the efficiency argument, but in a lot of his writing, he puts the moral argument about freedom front and center, right? And his feeling is that taxation, for example, and any form of economic planning of any sort, right, is tantamount to a kind of slavery.
Right. Okay.
Right.
So those of you who are at least as like old as I am will remember this argument from, or if you just read any of the political philosophy of the 80s, this was very much the discourse, right? Like any interference, taxation is theft, it's slavery.
Yeah, and because it implies that those who are planning and levying those taxes have a kind of special insight,
Right.
right? A kind of special wisdom.
It's the government picking
And
winners. They can't,
yeah, or they just have access to information that no one else does, and the idea amongst these laissez-faire advocates is that this information simply doesn't exist, right? And that's why we can't really engage in any effective economic planning. And anyone says and any institution that says they possess this information and can plan accordingly is exercising a kind of illegitimate power.
Right. So, okay. Yeah. Perfectly well summarized. Laissez-faire argument. We just there's no way to know enough to do a central plan. So that's fine and good.
And that's a good thing. And that's a good thing because we have this moral image of what freedom looks like, and it's incompatible, right, with state interventions.
Right. I missed that because you froze again. But
yeah,
that's all right. I want to go on to a next question, which was that. Okay, so we have this like laissez-faire argument that we hear a lot, and it's like from people like Milton Friedman and James Buchanan, and we return that to its origin in Hayek, and you say even Hayek would not push the laissez-faire argument as far as it gets pushed today and by his disciples, yeah? And so that's the efficiency argument. But I would like to also return a little more to this moral argument about self-realization in the market, because we spoke earlier about that coming from Hegel, yeah? And I think it's still like a really important part of why of the discourse today, and of why people think people should be free to act freely in markets, etc. Now, does the argument for human freedom, self-realization, a la Hegel, does that give us any case for laissez-faire economics? Or how would it if you tried? Okay, let me put it this way. There's a lot of laissez-faire people, and I think the position's insane.
I have an answer to this. I think the answer is we can only answer on the basis of the evidence that we have, and the evidence that we have is that even an approximation of the pure laissez-faire that these people desire is quite radically incompatible with the meaningful freedom of the vast majority of individuals.
Okay, why?
Well, because when these markets, when our society operates according to this laissez-faire ideology, right, we end up with some very bad outcomes that can constrain the freedom of individuals. So this happens on a couple of different planes, right? There's the personal plane, right? Simply the fact that the economy is a closed box, right, to the vast majority of the people who want to participate in it, right? An obvious implication of this emphasis on self-realization, right, is that there need to be meaningful opportunities for work.
Right.
Right. And if things are so closed off, right, if our economy is so radically inegalitarian that there are no such opportunities, right, that the only jobs are Uber drivers and food delivery people, right, then what that means is that meaningful self-realization, its possibility has been negated.
You forgot Amazon picker. Yeah.
And yes, Amazon picker, and I guess Amazon delivery person. So I mean, it's true on a personal level,
Uh-huh.
and I think it's also true on a political level, right? Like, I mean, as you know, this sort of laissez-faire world unfolds itself, as it becomes more inegalitarian, it also tends to become more plutocratic, right? Which is to say that political power and access to it, right, is defined exclusively according to income and wealth.
Right.
Right, this is one of the big themes in the chapter on John Rawls, right, where he talks a lot about the fair value, right, of the political
Uh-huh.
liberties, right. So we may all have the right to go out in public and speak and protest, but if those liberties are merely formal, right, if we're just yelling into the void and there's no meaningful sense that we are heard or that our demands are taken into account, right, then we're not fully free, right, when it comes to our political life. And so, again, so if laissez faire, as the way it's played itself out, it seems to be the case that we're neither free as workers and we're not really free as citizens. Then it seems to me that the rooting this defense
Uh-huh.
of laissez-faire in freedom, right, implies a quite impoverished
Well,
conception of freedom,
right. Okay,
and it's
so
sort of like a betrayal, right, of the sort of original root, right, of what I talk about in the
yeah,
book.
so I mean that's like one of the things I think is so important for people who are more on the left or at least not, let's say, fair guys, is that the concept of freedom and of self-realization is so important to our thinking about markets, right? And so
Hmm. Hmm.
Hegel falls on kind of the pro-market side in your story, but
Yes, without a doubt.
his argument for self-realization, it is plausible. I think that work can really serve these goals of self-development and
Hmm.
integrating yourself with other people and learning your importance in society, but other conditions have to hold true about the market. And if those conditions
Yes.
about our economy today don't hold true, then
Hmm.
using
Hmm.
argument to push for more laissez-faire is perverse. It's mistaken and actually will have, it looks like, the opposite effect if a lot
Hmm.
of what you're saying is true.
So I agree, and it raises the obvious question of, well, then what is the solution, right? Who is the agent for the restoration of the freedom that we have lost?
All right, and I await your answer.
Well, I mean, so I can tell you what some people that I cover in the
Right. So
book
your
think. I
your final
mean,
chapter is Thomas Piketty. So
yeah, yeah, Piketty. Yeah, I mean, again, Piketty is not anti-market by any means. He's not a rabid communist or anything like that. But he does think that we have fallen into an inegalitarian spiral, right? That and that the only way to get out of it is for the rich to pay a whole heck of a lot more
uh-huh.
tax.
Who's gonna
Right? So
make
in
them?
his right, so that is the $1 million question. I
More
get
than
actually
a
that's
million.
the $1 trillion question,
Yeah.
isn't it? I mean, I guess it depends on how you interpret Piketty. I interpret him as pretty pessimistic on this
Yeah.
front, right? I mean, his point is that okay, so if we want a tax on, not, I mean, income is a side concern. He's sort of much more interested in wealth from assets like capital,
Yeah.
not like
Income.
Yeah, so sorry, he's much less interested in income, and he's much more interested in the wealth generated by financial
Right,
assets, real
exactly.
estate, stocks, bonds, and things like that. And his feeling is that the real challenge when it comes to levying taxes on these sorts of instruments is that they are just so global by nature, right? Money is crossing borders in such an obscure and difficult to track way that he's ultimately quite pessimistic about the possibility of an effectively levying such an ambitious tax
Uh-huh.
plan, right? Which again is like taxing a small percentage of the billionaires and a slightly larger percentage of, well, so capital is quite pessimistic, I would say. I mean, he has a little bit of optimism when it comes to Europe because of the political infrastructure that already exists, right, in the EU.
Yeah.
But even so, he says we've fallen down into a spiral, and it's hard to see how we can
Well,
get
they
out.
have to they
So
have to
so
just shut
so
down Switzerland and Luxembourg and Andorra and
yeah,
Ireland.
yeah, I mean, it's well the lack of transparency that characterizes the banking communities in those countries is really at the root of the problem, right? If you want to effectively tax people, then you need to know how much they have,
Right.
how much they earn, and unfortunately, that is a very pressing and difficult problem. So maybe then a more realistic answer, or a more uh, practicable answer comes from Rawls, right, who uses a much more national framework for these sorts of things, right? Talks about the sorts of domestic political institutions required to restore freedom for a greater portion of society.
But
But
why? I
again,
mean, Rawls would depend on
the agent,
taxation, right? So how are you
yes,
going to pull
that's right.
that off? It
Yeah.
doesn't don't the same objections that you raised to Piketty arise for Rawls as well?
Hmm. Hmm. Um, I, I think that we probably have more information in the Rawlsian case about domestic wealth and income, right, than we do on the sort of like massive global scale that Piketty talks about. So you're right that taxation is without a doubt a big part of the Rawlsian program, right? He imagines a much more burdensome progressive tax designed to redistribute income from rich to poor, right? He also thinks that there ought to be um, a quite burdensome tax on bequests and inheritances because the intergenerational transmission of wealth, which is a big theme in Capital as well, also plagues Rawls. Um, at the level of politics, right, he talks about laws related to um, campaign financing and political speech, right? The access that certain groups have to mass media, right? These are sort of, I guess, more
All
practical
right. All right.
planks, right?
So look, I keep summarizing the whole story, but it helps get me back on track. So markets good until or sorry, markets bad until you realize you can use them to get out of feudalism. So when you're comparing it to living under a feudal master, markets good.
Market's
When you're
good.
comparing it to living under one of Stalin's 5-year plans, markets also good.
Mar- yes, market's also
But
good.
when you compare it to compare like the state of laissez-faire or market commercial society today to any of the philosophical justifications for it, it falls very, very short. It doesn't realize the efficiency that we want. It doesn't realize the human freedom that we want. And one of the big reasons you're pointing to through Piketty and Rawls is inequality, right? And so we're looking for an answer of how to reduce inequality.
We can even set the efficiency argument aside. I mean, we can say maybe markets are indeed the most efficient. Like maybe that they do. I mean, the evidence speaks for itself.
They make a lot of
That
billionaires.
they, yeah, they are. There is no better way to make a lot of money, but the question, right, relates to distribution,
Okay, well, I mean,
right?
you've mentioned possibilities about taxation and taxing inheritances, but you also have a chapter on Lenin. Have have we got any interesting answers there?
Oh, I'm not very kind to Lenin. I mean, I find the reason that I have a chapter on Lenin is because I find it much easier. Well, not easier, but I find that we understand Marx better when we get Lenin's side of it, right? But I'm not very kind to Lenin either. I
Right.
mean, I mean,
Well, look, you're
I
pessimistic about of Piketty's
I
solutions,
call him a
and
dismal failure. I mean, so anyway, the reason that there's a chapter on Lenin is because of a sort of subtle critique. Well, because of the fact that we don't get a lot of practical political institutional stuff in Marx,
okay,
right? So that's why I think that Lenin sees himself sort of cashing Marx out on at the political institutional level, right? What the dictatorship of the
uh-huh.
proletariat actually looks like, and of course, it's an unimaginable catastrophe.
Okay, so no revolution, Jeffrey. Fine. But suppose we shelve the idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat for the moment, and we talk about voting within the context of like capitalist countries nowadays, right? One of the really cool and interesting things about this book is that you have all these chapters of thinkers who are critical of market society and how it works. So you have Marx and Lenin, even though you're not that positive about Lenin, but you have all these critical voices. But what strikes me and is interesting is even the pro-market voices, the Smiths and the Hayeks. If you follow them, you still don't get to the level of laissez-faire capitalism that people want today. You don't get to neoliberalism. And so it seems like if I, even if I take the most like right-wing pro-market guys in your book, like Hayek, and I go based on his arguments, I still vote for the left-wing party, like the Democrats in the States or the NDP in Canada or Labour in the UK, something like that. Is that right? Does Hayek tell us to vote left?
Yes.
And I couldn't possibly interest you in a revolution.
I mean, right. Well, I mean, I can't believe that you've got me into defending Hayek so staunchly. I mean,
You're
I
defending
think that,
Hayek though as like a light of the electoral left that exists right
yeah.
now. Like follow Hayek,
Well, I mean,
vote NDP.
yeah. Well, compared to his acolytes, I think that's not an unfair depiction. But I mean, so you're saying, having accumulated all of this, all these opinions about markets and
Uh-huh.
whether they're good or bad. Um, I mean, I hate to take the sort of like predictable middle ground, right? But it seems to me
Canadians,
that
man,
we
every
just,
time.
yeah, I mean, we like you said, we went down that revolutionary road with Marx and Lenin, and well, we don't want to go down that road again. We've gone too far in the other direction with our with by following Buchanan and Friedman, and things didn't turn out very
Uh-huh.
well, as our present day reality attests to. Um, So it is, I think, a matter of finding that middle ground which leans left.
Look, I love this because right there's so much debate today, like whither the left, where should the left look for inspiration and thought, and they're like, is it Lenin,
No,
is it anarchism, is it this, is it that, and you're
no.
saying, hey, you know what, you're further left on the spectrum than any of the available parties if you follow Hayek. Which is, horrifying
Well,
in a way, but hilarious.
let's forget. I mean, we don't. I mean, we don't need to. I mean, could we? I think the point is, if you're trying to convince so let's say you're having an argument with someone who tends towards the right end of the ideological spectrum when it comes to markets, right? And you engage them in arguments and you want to meet them on their terms, right? You want to speak to them in a language that they're going to understand,
Yeah.
right? Well, then you have to speak to them about the language of freedom, right? And I think that is what my book is about, like trying to understand what freedom means in the context of a market society. And if we map the sort of freedom that we have today onto the sort of freedom that other people, the earliest defenders of market society, right, adopted, it's night and day.
Okay, so tell me,
Right?
to make it concrete, tell me how higher taxes will set me free.
Sure. um, we begin with the heroic assumption that those higher taxes will be effectively spent. And what effectively spent means in the context of the conversation that we've been having is that those taxes will be used for the sort of opportunity enlarging redistribution.
Like, what does that mean?
Right. So it means that people need to have a baseline of meaningful economic security. And that economic security is then the launching point for engaging in the sorts of experiments and the sorts of entrepreneurial activity that led really clever people to celebrate the market in the first place.
Great. All right.
Right. I mean, that's what it boils down to. Like, if we hate society today,
Yeah.
right? I guess we can take if out, right? We hate our society today,
Yeah.
right? Because we find that the avenue of opportunities has been so tragically constrained, right?
Yeah.
And so what we need to do is to enlarge the range of opportunities for self-development, self-realization, meaningful participation.
Right. So the reason
Right?
all this like market activity and getting richer mattered in the first place was because it would give us opportunities to like live a freer and better life. And so if it just leads to opportunities for tech billionaires to build bunkers in New Zealand and everyone else to lead a life of desperation online and off,
Yeah.
then even if markets are formally free, they're not creating any human freedom.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the reason that we began by celebrating these markets is because of the range of opportunities they presented. We keep bringing up this feudal contrast, but the idea is there were no meaningful opportunities, right? Your place in society was set for life, and you had no meaningful control over it, right? And the market kind of opened things up, right? Opened up a multitude of avenues for self-development and self-realization. And if those avenues
And
are
just
no
for like
longer
material
open, then
prosperity.
yeah, for Yeah, we begin with security, right? Meaningful economic security, and maybe we can even get to prosperity, right? But even security alone is a meaningful objective,
Yeah.
right? Which goes back to the tax question, right? Redistribution, the aim of redistribution through taxation should be the kind of universal security, right? Economic security that makes self-confidence possible, and with self-confidence, action, right? Activity.
Great. I love it. So I think that might be a good place to stop on the note that more taxation and redistribution will actually create more freedom, more human liberty than a more laissez-faire policy. And that's an interesting idea. We've been going on for a while. So in closing, could you just tell us where everyone can find you? Are you online on social media? And where can we buy the book?
My social media presence is very weak. I'm not going to tell you to buy the book on Amazon because that is, that's bad. Where can you buy the book? Probably not at your local bookstore, because I doubt your local bookstore would have this book. But
You can buy it on Amazon.
or maybe U of T Press. Is that a small business? Does that? No, probably not. But I guess U of T Press is the best way to purchase it. Or just email me and I'll send you a free copy.
Okay, so A History of Political Thought, Property, Labor, and Commerce from Plato to Piketty, from U of T Press, University of Toronto Press, in 2020.
Thanks, Clifton. Thanks for having me.
It was my great pleasure. Thanks for coming on, Jeffrey.